Good evening, welcome both to our participants here at the Royal Society and also welcome to our online participants for our Foundation for Science and Technology event, hybrid between physical and online participation. We're building the UK electricity grid. And this is a really important subject as we face the challenge of getting to net zero by 2050. That obviously requires an increase in total electricity generation, the capacity of the electricity grid. It's also going to require changes in the shape of the grid as it takes on new functions and works in different ways. And also, a very interesting point just made by our first speaker, it also requires changes in the architecture, the political economy around the grid to ensure that it's run in a way that both enables that increase in capacity and enables that redesign in how it functions. So we've got three excellent speakers coming from with different perspectives. After the speakers, we will be taking questions both from you here physically in the room, but also from people on Zoom. If you are on Zoom and wanted to place a question, do start using it now, but please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. I'll set up my laptop so that I can see the questions coming in on Q&A as well. And of course, do upvote if there are questions that have already been put that you very much endorse. Do upvote. That helps give us a steer as to the key lines of forensic questioning that our participants at the Foundation for Science and Technology really want us to pursue. And here on the screen is your handy guide about questioning through Q&A. So without further ado, let me turn and introduce our first speaker, Nick Windsor. He has been chair of the Energy Systems Catapult since 2015. He has served in a range of other capacities as well. He's a member of the COP26 Science Priorities Task and Finish Advisory Group. He's a member of the Net Zero Expert Group advising the Secretary of State. He's non-executive director on the board of Greencoat UK Wind. He's had a 30-year career in the energy sector, including serving as UK and European CEO of the board of National Grid. So it's great that Nick has been able to spare the time to join us. We very much look forward to your opening remarks. Over to you.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you, David, for that very generous welcome. Lovely to be here to talk about such an important topic. A few sort of key headlines for me, which I'll then elaborate on. The current most likely route to decarbonising the UK energy system would probably lead to demand on the grid. I'll hear from other numbers, I'm sure, from other speakers, but you know, of the order of 3 times as much demand on the electricity grid as the one today. If it had this, well, the demand would be 3 times. The question is, what sort of structure of grid do you need to deal with that extraordinary increase? If you were to structure it as we have today, to merely build more wires and transformers and substations, it would take, I think from our experience in the last century of building what we've got today, it would take you decades. It would cost tens of billions of pounds. It would probably strain public acceptance, particularly in sort of sanctioning and getting new infrastructure through planning permission. The existing grid was built in very different circumstances where, for example, pylons striding through the countryside communities was by and large welcomed back in the 60s and 70s, and those conditions aren't those that that we have today. And we know that from trying to build new transmission lines, for example, to Hinkley nuclear power station, and how significant sanctioning and planning permission can be as an issue. So therefore, what I'm going to suggest is that we need to have an entirely different approach to thinking about the grid that we need for the future, if indeed, it's right that we need to supply a much greater demand for electricity. So I'll explain why I believe the challenge is so large, and then I'll explain a different approach. Currently, electricity provides, I don't know what it is exactly these days, but the order of 20% of our end-use demand. And the most likely decarbonisation route for transport and domestic heating, at least, as I'm sure people in the room are very aware, is likely to be via electric cars and heat pumps. To do most of the work on decarbonising heat and transport in that way, sort of, will probably get you something like 3 times the demand. It might be 4, it might be 2, depending on how you do it. Undoubtedly, other technologies will have major roles, particularly hydrogen, biofuels. There's an awful lot of talk about hydrogen at the moment, but actually they're likely to change, whether it's 3 or 4, and will make a difference. But whichever way you look at it, in my view, electricity demands are going to increase substantially. So biofuels and hydrogen will probably be limited somewhat by land use considerations in the case of biofuels, and in terms of hydrogen, by the scarcity of green electricity. And green electricity to make green hydrogen is going to remain scarce for decades, undoubtedly. Just to decarbonise our existing electricity footprint will take us quite a long time, never mind a substantial increase. So we're likely to use biofuels and hydrogen, in my view, where they really are the absolute best solution. Perhaps things like aviation, industrial heat, heavy transport, and we're likely to have to be very careful to use them, if we're wise, where there really are much worse alternatives, rather than for decarbonising domestic heat, for example, in a wholesale way, or transport in a wholesale way. In particular, I want to say a quick defence of this position in terms of a word on heat pumps. In a world where we desperately are going to be trying to create more green energy, the idea that we're not excited by a technology which can take 1 unit of scarce, precious green energy and turn it into 3. That's a very strange world to me. And I sometimes think, it's part of the problem of our lack of excitement about heat pumps, because heat pump sounds really dull. And I sort of wonder, maybe we should call them heat miracles or heat wonders or heat magicians. Perhaps we should dispense the word heat. Or, they are a fantastic resource for us in a world where green energy is going to be so short. To convert 1 to 3, we shouldn't forget that. And to reinforce that point, in a world where you're trying to balance hydrogen heat pumps as solutions for domestic heat. I mean, there's no doubt hydrogen will do significant amounts of domestic heat, probably, though, around industrial applications of hydrogen. But in a world where the incremental source of green electricity to go into either heat pumps or to go into making green hydrogen, the reality is that you need, if the incremental source is wind farms, which it probably is, even with substantial encouragement to things like nuclear, then you need 5 times as many wind turbines to do it with hydrogen as you do to do it with heat pumps, because electrolysis is 70% efficient, and heat pumps are 300% efficient. So the maths is quite easy on this. The scale of this challenge on the grid means that I should certainly immediately mention the importance of driving forward building efficiency. We are desperately overdue a really strong focus on a determination on building efficiency, both for new buildings and as retrofit. This challenge is so enormous, we just have to start by making it smaller. Not only will electricity demand overall be higher, it will have a different shape. And when in 2003, I moved from being responsible for the electricity system in the UK to being responsible for the electricity and gas system, I was, as an electrical engineer, a bit horrified to find out the peakiness of domestic heat. You know, we're talking about 5-6 times, peakiness compared to, what I was used to in electricity of a factor of 2 or something like that. So we do need to worry about this peakiness of demand that may well get displaced on the electricity system. On the electricity, so that's demand. On the electricity supply side of the grid, of course, things are changing as well, very, very much. Moving from large, remote-ish, but inland fossil fuel generation to a blend of very remote, very large offshore wind farms and nuclear power stations, plus a plethora of small and very small, highly local and distributed sources. That's very different. And overall, the set of sources will multiply, therefore increasing the challenges of grid coordination. We already, because of the intermittency of renewables, we're already up from, I think, what used to be in my day, about 60 gigawatts installed capacity to plus 100, because, of course, the utilization factor of renewables is much lower. And yet, of course, in terms of the grid, it may be that wind farms are at 30 or something, 30% utilization, but when it's blowing, you need full grid capacity to use that resource. So there are lots of different things going on with the design of the grid. Trying to build more wires and transformers to cope with all this will, as I've said, be long, expensive, and unpopular. So we not only have to reduce the size of this challenge, but we have to think of other solutions. And luckily, we have a variety of opportunities ahead of us that can help us reduce the challenge and use new technologies and new ideas to make the grid work with much less than an expansion of 3 times in terms of the wires and transformers and substations. And those things are to think about the demand, the supply side, storage in particular. So on the demand side, we know that a lot of this new demand is of quite different nature to what was there before. So we're used to electricity demands, which are really about, walking over to your kettle and being able to turn it on, the kettle boils, and there you have your cup of tea. So lots of our demand was those sorts of instant use type of things that couldn't be displaced in time in a way. A lot of the new demands are going to be things that are much more flexible in time. So particularly car charging and heat pumps are going to be able to be displaced in time in a smart energy system. And a smart energy system is what we need to defray the large amounts of investment that are potentially out there. We need to use those local distributed generation sources, which are a huge boon in this world because they reduce the intensity of grid loading, because by and large, we're used to a grid system that drives the power from high voltages down to low voltages, and that's where the constraints are. And we will need to optimize and develop and deploy storage technologies. We must never forget that our current energy system is based more than anything on stored energy. That's what fossil fuels are. That's why we've got away for so long with being able to just meet customers' instant requirements for energy, because we have lots of inherent storage in fossil fuels. We will need to replicate those. And to bring all this together, we have another great opportunity, which is in digital and communication technologies, which are now so widespread and so important. And so to bring all this together, the optimization of storage, demand, and intermittent and local generation sources, we need a smart grid system powered by, in terms of technologies, digital and communication technologies, to optimize our grids, not from wholesale, not from the top down, as we have done historically, from the bottom up, so that we make the most of the grid system that we've got at the moment. To balance grids from the bottom and the top, but certainly from the bottom first, where that's economics do. We don't do any of that at the moment. To support this change, we will need a number of changes to how we manage our energy systems. A real focus on innovation in energy systems, which of course the Energy Systems Catapult is championing from our headquarters in Birmingham. We will need vigorous engagement with customers, because we need a much smarter grid that involves customers and moves and enables us to optimize the grid system while satisfying their needs for energy for their day-to-day lives. We need very different regulation. We need more granular energy markets, which can encourage that very detailed optimization, both in planning and operational timescales of the electricity system. We need local. We need local. We need to have each area of the country on a similar basis generating local energy plans to make the most of the resources that are there and to operate them optimally. And to support all of this, we will need substantial new roles for local authorities, for regional organisations, to dovetail in with national government devolved authorities, devolved administrations as we have today. So my call is for a very different approach to building out the grid with the new demands on it, which is based on a changed approach to institutional architecture and the deployment of digital and communication technologies to balance the grid from the bottom up. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. I should apologize to our online participants. I think there are some issues about sound quality which we are trying to resolve, but I hope that it is possible for you to participate. Our second speaker is Dr. Cathy McClay. She is Director of Sembcorp Energy UK. She's worked for energy companies in the UK, France and Netherlands, and before her current job she was Head of Future Markets at National Grid, where she was responsible for developing our electricity and gas markets. And it's great, we're very much looking forward to hearing her advice for us on the way forward for the grid. Cathy.
Right, I'll probably start pressing lots of buttons with my iPad if I'm not careful. So you may be thinking, what's the Director of Trading and Optimisation of Sembcorp, a company I've probably never heard of, here talking about the grids? Well, Sembcorp is actually, we're a FREng company with a large presence in Singapore, India, Vietnam, China, where they're really at the centre of the decarbonisation over there. We We've currently got about 2.6 gigawatts of renewables. We're looking to grow that to 10 gigawatts by 2025 and have about 70% of our profits come from renewables. Now, in the UK, we aren't renewables developers, but we're really focused on the energy transition. So I'm really interested in how the grid's going to develop. We've got, up in Teesside, we've got the largest private wires network in the UK. For those old enough, it's the old ICI site. And we have biomass, good quality CHP. It's the biggest hydrogen production and consumption in the UK. And our key challenge up there is delivering decarbonisation for our customers. So we're looking at CCUS, we're looking at hydrogen. The other bit, which was what really attracted me to Sembcorp, was we've got a fleet of very flexible generation, like Nick's just been talking about. It's all embedded in the low voltage distribution network. And we've got about 650 megawatts of gas engines, which are there to help the system operator balance the grid. And we've got batteries as well. At the minute, we've got about 70 megawatts. We've got another 50 megawatts coming online this year, and then another 150 coming online. So we're very much at that flexible end, and we feel we're at the centre of the transition. And before that, as it was said, I was at the system operator. I was actually designing the markets that I'm now taking part in, and it was very much all about the smart end of the grid. And that bit is really, really important, as Nick said, for getting the demand profile right, etc., because we are in a situation where we're going to have a lot more demand on the system through the decarbonisation. But there's so many angles you can come at when you're talking about the grid. So tonight I decided to talk about the thing that's kind of worrying me the most right now, which is the impact of wind on the system. And it could in some ways be called the Scottish problem as well. But it's probably the Scottish and the East Coast problem is how it's going to be defined. Because for our decarbonisation, we're reliant on building a lot of offshore winds. Now, on our system right now, yes, we have about 100 gigawatts of generation to serve a peak demand of about 40 to 50 on the transmission system. And we've currently got 25 gigawatts of wind, and that's split pretty equally between onshore and offshore right now. Now, but we've got an aspiration to build 40 gigawatts, to get to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So that's an increase of 28 gigawatts. So that's as much as we've got on the system right now in total, coming on by 2030, which is only 8 and a bit years away. It's not that far. And when I was looking through some of the system operator kind of projections, by 2030, they expect that there'll be 30 to 40 gigawatts of generation in Scotland if we connect things the way we would normally do. And we'd have 6 gigawatts of demand in Scotland. So we need to get the rest of that power out of Scotland. And currently we're limited to transferring 6 gigawatts of power to England, because if we try to get any more out than that, the wires start overheating and we can't get it out. So when I do that maths, that's quite an interesting problem to solve. And there's different ways of doing it as well. And of course, we're never going to get, if you've got 30 to 40 gigawatts of generation in Scotland, it's not going to be producing the whole time. You know, we've got 25 gigawatts of wind on the system right now. I'm looking at wind every day because that affects a lot whether my generators are going to get run or not. The peak I normally see is about 15 gigawatts. The lowest I've seen in the last year is 200 megawatts. That's a heck of a swing to manage on the system as well. That makes it quite interesting. But a lot of the time we simply can't get the power out even now. And that means we're building all these wind farms and we're wasting the power if we can't use it. And on the system operator, they said if we don't sort this out, 80% of the time that we can't get all the power out of Scotland by 2030, 80% of the time we're wasting that renewable energy that we're putting on. And every time we can't get the energy out, that costs us money, because if the wind farms want to generate, because every megawatt hour they generate, they get paid for under their CFD or under the renewable obligation certificate. And that's worth quite a lot of money to them. And so if they can't generate, they say, well, I want to be paid what I would have got. So you have to pay up to about right now £80 a megawatt hour to switch them off. And then you have to bring something on in Scotland. So the cost of those constraints at the minute are about £500 million a year of constraints in the system. Now, when I was first in the system operator in 2015, I used to say it costs us about £1 billion a year to manage the system. So these costs are going up quite a lot. But I was at a system operator event yesterday, and they were suggesting if we don't do something about this, they expect the costs to rise to between $1 billion and $2.5 billion on these constraint costs by sort of the next 5 years. So we're building wind at the minute that we just can't use. And it's not just the Scottish boundary, it's also East Anglia, where we've got Sizewell and all of those generators coming in. So what can we do about that? Well, the first thing you could do is we could attract more demand into Scotland, because there's a lot of generation there. We could attract more demand. In my talk yesterday, I described it as the reverse plantation, and because I've originally got Scottish heritage with my surname. And you could do that by having a price that reflects the fact that the wind isn't as valuable right now because we can't get it out. And maybe we could attract things like hydrogen electrolyzers and stuff into Scotland, or more business, factories, etc., data sites, things like that. I've spent a lot of time looking at whether it's worth putting storage in Scotland, and not batteries so much, because they're 1 or 2 hours at the minute. They'll probably go up to about 4 hours. I was looking at more long-term storage, cryogenic storage, where we could maybe pump for 10 hours and liquefy air and then use that when you release it. But if you're getting to the point that constraint is there 70, 80% of the time, it's very hard to use storage to solve the problem, because it's hard to monetize it. You can get the energy in, but it's hard to get the energy out, and that can be quite difficult. We can try and use the wires between Scotland and England more effectively, and actually get more out of them by being smart in the way we use them. And I know that the transmission operator has actually managed to upgrade the transfer without actually building more wires, which has been good. And then the final solution is, and although Nick said it's expensive, etc., we do actually need to build more wires as well, but hopefully less wires than if we don't do all the other smart things. And if we look at what we are building, so in my time, we've upgraded some of the lines between England and Scotland, and we also built, because building lines is getting the planning permission, it can take years. And we built the West Coast, they call it the bootstrap. There's a line that goes from Scotland to Connors Quay in Wales, and it's subsea, and it actually carries power from Scotland into Wales. And that's been in place for a while. It's been a bit, we used a new technology. It's been a bit, it goes down quite a lot. The market can't see when it's gone down, so it's a bit inefficient and stuff. But we're proposing building lines. The first proposal is we're going to build lines down the East Coast, one right from Peterhead to Drax, so North Yorkshire, of 2 gigawatts, and another one from Torness on the east coast of Scotland down to Hawthorne Pit, which is around Durham. When I looked it out, that kind of bit of North Yorkshire. Now, the system operator runs a process every year where they look at all of the transmission owners say, we want to build this stuff. And they want to build it because they get the regulatory asset base improved, they make more money and stuff. But what's really weird for me is that these lines, since 2018, the system operator has been saying, yeah, proceed, go ahead and build these 2 lines. But it's only, we only got regulatory approval for it in 2021. And it's now going through planning, and it's expected online in 2029 and 2030. So that's like 10 years more since they said it was going on. And actually, when I looked, the projects were first suggested in 2011, believe it or not. But at that point, the network was very different. We didn't imagine all this offshore wind. But just building stuff, we have to build it more cleverly. So at the minute, if you look at offshore wind farms, it's very radial in its approach. You get an offshore wind farm, you connect it to the coast. You get another offshore wind farm, you connect it to the coast. And when you're building that much offshore wind, there's going to be a lot of connections. They all need planning. That's going to be difficult. And each wind farm hasn't got any redundancy as well, because it's only got one connection into land. So there has been some really good work and joined up thinking by this. And it's the Offshore Transmission Network Review. And it's a holistic review to build like a grid in the North Sea, effectively. And the system operators have been looking at this. They've been asked by the government to look at it to meet the objective of connecting 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And what's interesting is I sat on one of their challenge panels, actually. The chair of the challenge panel's in the room this evening, so she can talk about it much better than me. But when you look at the plan, instead of connecting each one in on its own, you look at it holistically and collect a network. Believe the estimate at the minute is a reduction in capital of 6 billion over the lifetime out to 2050, and only half of the onshore assets you need if you go down the same route. So in terms of the system, I do think we need to build more wires, but we need to do it cleverly. And we need to do it more quickly as well, if we're not gonna waste the wind, if you like. So what do we need to be able to do that? Well, firstly, I think we need joined up thinking. So we've come out and said, we want to be the Saudi Arabia of wind, was that the quote, I think? So we've said we're going to build a lot of wind, but then we haven't said we're going to build the wires that go with it or how we're going to get that wind. So joined up thinking is quite important for me. And I think the Offshore Transmission Network Review is a great idea. The results of it are due, I think, in June when I last read, but we now need to commit and deliver to it, because so often we come up with good ideas and then we don't really commit. And that needs the joined up thinking across the system operator, regulator and government. And we probably do need a bit, like I'm a markets person, I hate central planning, I hate being told what to do, but we probably do need a bit more central planning as we're having in this case with the offshore. And at present, the system operator advises on what lines should be built through their network's options assessment process every year. And I used to sit in that, but it's only advice. There's no compulsion behind it. So the network operators go, no, I don't fancy that at the minute, or my return's not going to be good at it. And so there is a question, because we're looking at, the system operator is going to split away from National Grid into being an independent system operator. Is it something that the new future system operator could take on, perhaps? And I think the final thing is we just need to be a bit bolder in what we do. When I was at the system operator, I was doing the Rio plans, and the regulator was saying to me, yeah, Cathy, we really want you to be bold. We need you to take more risks to get to net zero because the prize is so big. And I went, right, so what happens if it goes wrong? Oh, you wear all the risk, don't worry about it. And it was like, well, that's not going to work. And you're going to make me really risk averse, and we're not going to get there. So building wires, as we see, takes a long time, and planning, etc. So if we wait until we're absolutely certain we need a line or we need something before we build it, then likely it's going to come too late. So perhaps we should consider things, not like building wires all over the place, but things like anticipatory planning actually goes some way down the process, the hard bits, because planning's a real pain. and maybe just be that bit bolder so we get to net zero. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I'm pleased to report I think we've made a bit of progress as well at improving the sound quality for our online participants. I hope so. Thank you, Cathy. Well, your description of what you eloquently call the Scottish problem is a very good intro to our third speaker from the University of Strathclyde, Professor Keith Bell, who holds the Scottish Power Chair in Smart Grids at the university. He's a member of the UK's Climate Change Committee, a co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre, a chartered engineer, and we're very grateful to you, Keith, for joining us and look forward to what you've got to say. Over to you.
Okay, so thanks very much. Lovely to see you all. I thought I'd give you something else to look at other than me. So I've got some slides, and it's kind of a typical academic thing to have it as a crutch to kind of use to kind of hopefully keep myself to time as well. And I'm delighted to follow two such interesting, stimulating speakers as Nick and Cathy. I'm very pleased that Nick and set out the bigger energy system context. I find myself quite a lot these days talking about the wider energy system, because that's what we've got to think about, the whole kind of wide challenge. But tonight I'm going to indulge my kind of engineering nerd and go into some of those sorts of challenges. And I'm very pleased to Fiona, who I was talking to earlier, who actually got the weak literary joke in the title. Anyway, I'll move on. So Cathy and Nick have both alluded to some of the sort of market challenges and some of the sort of structural and regulatory sort of issues. I'm not really going to dwell on them. I mean, these are some of the things that we can see present at the moment and looking forward in terms of the investment that we need to get. And of course, some of these are outside of our control, but quite a lot of them, you could argue, are within our control, within the industry, government, or the regulator. And we could discuss how much these are good things, bad things, and what we could do about them. But I'm not going to talk about all that stuff. I'm going to take an engineer's perspective instead tonight. So we already know, we've heard about it, that the system is changing towards more use of variable renewables, wind and solar. Hydro counts as a variable renewable. It depends on the weather as well. And what is now being termed quite often inverter-based resources. So that's the kind of electrical technology using power electronics that connects the source of the energy to the electricity system. So these are kind of, we're not using to the same extent these kind of big thermal power stations where we made heat to make lots of steam under high pressure to turn a turbine, which uses a synchronous generator to generate the electricity. And there are particular features of that we're not getting anymore. Well, when it's windy and sunny. When it's not windy and sunny, well, that's another story. So how can we make efficient use of whatever low carbon energy is available at the time that it's available? How can we meet the demand, pretty much all the time? Can we keep the system stable while we're doing that? And can we do all of the above at least cost? So yeah, there's not a lot for us to do, really. Now, the thing is that stuff happens, and it's always happened. And disturbances happen on the system, and that's what we've got to be able to manage. It's what Nick, when he was in charge of the system operator, that's what his people were all concerned with all of the time. And if we're not careful, some people are quite likely to blame the transition to renewables on whatever happens as a result. And I think it's very important to be clear about what's going on, because these sorts of things have always happened. And sometimes, you can look around the world. There's basically a national or a regional blackout somewhere in the world, once or twice, 3 times every year. We just, hope it's not us, and we have to make sure that it isn't us. But we can't say it will never happen. It could happen. We just need to do our best to make sure it doesn't, and manage this transition in the best way. And if we are hearing somebody who's blaming it on wind, we have to get out and look and see what's actually happened and explain what did happen. As here was the Scottish problem written a different way from a couple of years ago, my daughter found that headline quite amusing, which you could probably tell from my accent. Now, that particular event did lead to disconnection of 1.1 million electricity customers spread across, actually as out in England and Wales. In Scotland we got away with it because of the settings of some of the devices, but it had a particular impact in the southeast of England, affecting particular trains that kind of saw system frequency fall and kind of gave up and needed people to go out with laptops to restart them. Now, one thing that a lot of people talk about is, as a consequence of losing all that thermal plant and the synchronous machines, is a reduction of the system's inertia. That's just a store of energy in terms of the rotating mass. Now, this particular event, it wasn't to do with the lack of inertia, but it did show what happened if you fail to manage system frequency and keep it within, the acceptable operating limits. A lot of the plant is designed only to operate within those certain limits, and you could get into a cascade where you end up with a blackout. That has happened in other parts of the world. And on this event, things tripped because of a falling frequency that shouldn't have done, and other things that should have responded to the fall frequency, failed to do so. And if either of these things hadn't happened, we wouldn't have disconnected 1.1 million customers. Now, good news, there are things we can do about this. So we can make use of a variety of sources of energy, the kinds of batteries that Sembcorp is developing, for example, with the power electronics and with the appropriate controls to respond quickly and arrest these changes and stabilize the system. And even better news, the system operator now realizes this and has kind of articulated some markets to get those things providing that kind of service. Okay, my second challenge. One of the things that these synchronous generators give you is current, lots of current. That's very dangerous when there's a short circuit somewhere on the network. But it also helps you to identify automatically where that fault is and to isolate it safely with the appropriate equipment before the whole system comes down. So if we're getting rid of all that synchronous plant and replacing it with other stuff, there's a lack of short circuit current in certain places that might mean that faults are not identified and cleared in the right way, which could threaten the stability of the system. The good news, though, is there are things we can do about it, albeit we're still working it out. We could change the characteristics of the power electronic controls, or we could change the algorithms in the protection equipment. Something that Nick has alluded to already, which actually is either an opportunity or a threat, depending on how we manage it, is the growth of distributed resources, small-scale stuff. Solar panels on roofs, single wind turbines. Actually, there's a lot of other, combined heat and power plant, waste to power plant, connected within the distribution networks. Also, potentially lots of flexible demand, such as Nick was talking about earlier. So they can really help the system in terms of managing those variations. But unfortunately, on that event on August 9th, 2019, they hindered the situation. They made it worse, not helped by the fact that the system the distribution network operators don't really know what it's doing or how it's going to behave. And that's, it seems to have grown without us really realizing. So we need to get a handle on that and work out better monitoring and utilize the control capability to help the grid rather than hinder it. So, could be a good thing if we do it well. Okay, I'm going to spend a few moments on this one because this kind of picks up some of, I think, what Cathy was talking about the summers. There's lots of wind, and actually there's other times when there's not so much. So what we've plotted here is we've taken the demand in each hour of the year, and we've kind of just sorted those numbers from the smallest on the right to the biggest on the left. That's what we call the load duration curve or the demand duration curve. That's the dashed lines. And we could also look in each hour of the year and say, well, how much wind power is available in that hour? And solar power and hydropower. In other words, all these variable renewables. That's what I'm calling a residual demand. And we could stack that up in the same way for history, what we've observed, or we could do some modeling of what might happen in the future. So we've got a 2020 simulation. Okay, this was done in 2019 based on what we thought could have happened if we hadn't had the pandemic. So that's the kind of solid blue line. We've also, grateful to my colleague Callum McKeever for doing the modeling here, the yellow line for a 2030 GB scenario with 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, and a 2040 scenario is the green line with even more wind. So the point here is that we've got challenges at both ends of that curve. When it's not windy and sunny, what else are we going to use to meet the demand for electricity? And by the way, I'm not very happy with the demand numbers here. They should be higher. I took these from the European Network of Transmission System Operators. So I don't think it quite captures what we're trying to do with heat pumps. EVs, you can kind of smooth it out a bit, but heat pumps especially. But at the other end, a bit below the line, that's times we've got a surplus. So rather, as Cathy was talking about, what are we going to be able to use it to do? We don't want to waste it. So that's going to have some kind of cost if we have to curtail that really useful, nice low carbon output. And we could look in at single days. That kind of loses the kind of the sequential nature of what's really happening. And zoom in. Here's one particular day that just happens to come out of the modelling. We kind of modelled a kind of typical weather year, looked at what would be going on. So the residual demand curve is that orange line. So it's not very windy and sunny that day, a day in winter. We might try and smooth out that by using all this flexibility of EVs and whatever else we can do. Let's get a flat green line, let's say, very idealistically, but that still leaves quite a lot of energy under the line to be met in that day by something other than wind, solar and hydro, which we're using as much of it as we can get on that day. So that's quite a lot of energy. And if we had a week like that, I mean, I've heard this term they use in Germany of Dunkelflaute. You know, it's not inconceivable we'll have a week quite similar to that. So where are we going to get all that energy from? Storage could be a big part of that, whether it's stored hydrogen manufactured via low carbon means, it could be compressed air, such as Cathy was talking about. You might say, well, by that time, we will have lots of electric vehicles with batteries. Well, couldn't we use those batteries? So here's a bit of logic on the right-hand side, trying to work out, well, how much energy might that equate to? So another colleague, James Dixon, kind of had a bit of a go at this. So you come up with 330 gigawatt hours. That's about a third of what you would need on one of these days. So it helps, but doesn't tell the whole story. We need this flexibility, of course, to kind of meet those changes of residual demand and fill in those gaps. There's lots of things that might do this, including flexible demand. Now, you want it to be able to kind of ramp up or down quickly. Wind farms can do it if it's already windy, but you also want to be able to rely on it to operate tomorrow or next week or the week after. And when it's running, you want it to be able to continue to run and continue to produce energy to fill in those gaps, those Dunkelflaute. So I think we need these three characteristics. Now, unfortunately, none of these things is perfect and does all of it at the same time, which means we need a mix. Okay, so I think we still need to work out how we get the right mix. And here's a bit that Cathy's talked about already about getting enough network capacity. So she talked about the constraint costs are going up. You know, we can't use all of the nice wind in the north. We have to reduce the output, use something else in the south. Unfortunately, that tends to mean fossil fueled. Let's try and do as little of that as possible. And, you know, the cost of doing that has to be picked up somewhere. And yeah, we can get more wind connecting in Scotland. Even if we had only a fraction of the ScotWind results from the leasing of the Scottish seabed that came out in January, it's still a lot more and will change those flows a lot. But those are those 4 East Coast bootstraps that have been proposed. Well, hey, it looks like we need to get on and do it. It's not just the offshore stuff. We still need to get the power on through the onshore as well, you know, and as well as that. By the way, here's Cathy, here's a coordinated offshore network design. It's very high level, but from 10 years ago. And by coincidence, the scenario we looked at for 2030 was 40 gigawatts of wind in offshore in UK waters. Hey, wow, who got that target from there? So we just need to do a lot of this. Okay, my last one before I wrap up. Managing control interaction. A lot of this power electronics is very flexible. You can do a lot of stuff really quickly. But at the moment, a lot of it is designed kind of ignorant of what else is on the system. It pretends the system is a kind of some sort of idealized equivalent. The real world has all these things interacting with each other, and it does happen from time to time. They interact adversely, and these oscillations appear almost out of nowhere. And we were lucky in August 2021 that they disappeared again without causing anything really bad and starting to trigger a cascade of outages. So these inverter-connected resources bring lots of opportunities, but also lots of challenges. There are lots of challenges around the kind of modeling of them and analysis. There are challenges around the commercial confidentiality of what's under the lid. What is it really doing? It can be changed really quickly and easily. It's just software, provided we know what to change it to. And we need new tools and methods for the system operator to make sure all these things are going to behave in a kind of nice, controlled, stable manner. Okay, what I've not talked about, you might have heard engineers, electrical engineers talking about system strength. I've deliberately not talked about that because I don't actually find it a very helpful term, because when you hear different engineers talking about it, they're talking about usually 3 different things. which could be solved actually in different ways, even though they are all at the same time, you could argue, consequences of the closure of thermal power plant using synchronous machines. So let's get rid of that term. Okay, so there we are. I've had my 6 challenges in search of some order, but I don't want to end on a negative about how difficult it all is, because there are fantastic opportunities which we should be realizing. And I believe we can. Work is already started on a lot of these things. But if there's, for me, one overarching challenge to all of this, it is this question of whether we are investing enough in getting the right knowledge and skills within the sector to solve all these challenges. Okay, I won't use the additional slides, you'd be glad to know. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Good. Glasses, Kate.
What a fascinating, complex problem we've got here with innovation, of course, in green energy, decarbonising, engineering challenges, system design challenges. And I'm very grateful to our 3 speakers who I thought their presentations complemented each other very well, with the scene setting from Nick and Cathy then confronting us with some of the design issues, and Keith really getting into some of the engineering challenges. I've got some questions coming up online, but I'm going to first ask if there are people in the audience here physically, if there's anybody who wants to ask a question to set the ball rolling. Yeah, let's have the gentleman here in the front row, and then I'll turn to a couple of online questions. So let's start here, please.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I mean, at the moment, we're looking at generating electrical power. Perhaps we should be actually looking at the problem itself, which is how much electrical power we need. I mean, perhaps we should be looking at controversial things like 24-hour working, coming up with sites where we say heavy engineering must be done at night when we're not using much else. And also there are set sites in Scotland where you put your heavy engineering, where there's plenty of power. So we actually sort of really look at the opportunity here to do things. We are going to have to change the way we work. And we may not like 24-hour working, but it is going to be a factor. And obviously it's, you know, it's very costly, building loads and loads and loads of machinery, which perhaps you don't need by doing things smarter.
Well, that goes back to, that challenges the opening points that Nick made. I'm going to start with Nick, but we'll hear from all of our panelists, which is, are we indeed going to be moving to a high electricity and, of course, decarbonised electricity world?
Well, I think it's highly likely that we will transfer a lot of heat demand and transport onto the electricity system. There are obviously alternative options. I very much agree with your point that demand flexibility is going to be very important. The flatter we can get the load curve, the better. So, of course, we had initiatives on this, didn't we? Economy 7. That was all. Yeah. That was. You know, for decades we've been playing with things like this. So that was very positive, and of course led to the use of storage heaters in houses. And of course, there may well be very good applications for some modern technologies, more modern applications of things like electricity storage in homes or storage heaters. And Cathy did also touch on that point about is it cheaper to move a lot of electricity from where it's plentiful as green electricity, or is it cheaper to move the industry or indeed to encourage larger population centres close to where it is? And I think those are things that need to be thought very carefully about, and probably signalled through a variety of markets and regulation so that we optimize some of those opportunities.
Thank you. Cathy?
Yeah, and it's because in the past it was about flattening the peak demand, because then that would mean we have to bring less generation on over the peak and we need less wires and stuff. It's actually got a little bit more interesting and complicated than that. Like we've had a system in the past that generation follows demand. We really need to flip that on its head and have demand as much as possible following generation. And the load shifting is much more complex than just day-night, because as I said, some days I come in and there's 15 gigawatts of wind in the system, and other days there's like 200 megawatts, which is basically zero on the system. And things like that make a difference. And a big problem, one of the biggest problems we've not solved on the system looking forward, is that when you look at the amount of renewables, as Nick said, we need to build an awful lot more because of this intermittency. The overbuild in summer is immense. And right now I'm coming in the mornings, and by mid-afternoon, there's 7 gigawatts of solar generating right now because it's nice and sunny. But in summer, we're going to have a lot of wind and solar excess generation. But it's how do we store that and maybe shift it to the winter? Can we actually do that seasonal storage thing? The overnight, the heating one is quite interesting, because I remember in our house we had Economy 7 and we had storage heaters, which is essentially concrete blocks in our council house. That's what it was. But now you've got these really, I was going to say cool, but they're actually quite warm, I guess, heat batteries, which uses phase change materials, and those along with the heat pumps to shift your heat load, so you're actually using the generation at a different time. There's lots of wonderful technologies, but you're completely right. We have to start shifting our demand around. It's slightly more difficult because it's not just day-night anymore. It's shifting it for if it's windy, if it's Sunday, all that kind of stuff makes a big difference.
Thank you. In a moment, I'm going to turn to a storage question we've had. But Keith, just on this, how much can demand shifting contribute here?
I'm sceptical about whether it's really going to save the day, because there's a limit to how much you can do. So you're going to need heating when it's cold, and we're all going to be cold at a similar time because we're facing similar weather. However, it's definitely worth having whatever shifting you can get, and better insulated buildings, I think we were talking about earlier, would allow you to be, you can preheat using your heat pump, which, by the way, this is the key point, actually. I think it's about being much more efficient in our use of energy, that it can serve the end uses, but use less energy doing it. And an electric vehicle is much more energy efficient than a combustion engine vehicle. And a heat pump, as Nick was saying, is much more efficient than a gas boiler or a hydrogen boiler. So that's the main point, is about being much more efficient with what we do, and especially around heat.
Right, we've touched on demand. I think now I'm going to invite our panelists to talk about storage. And we've got an interesting point from Michael Corcoran, who is asking, would it be better if community groups were to focus more on investing in storage than investing in small-scale generation? He's interested in that. He's focused on the storage issue. There are some of us who are so behind the curve, we think the most sophisticated technology for storage is pumping water to the top of a mountain in Snowdonia, which I think scored quite highly on your list of options. Though obviously eventually you run out, so it didn't score highly for persistence, but it scored highly for the others. What if we built a few more of those systems in the Scottish mountains? But what other smart batteries? We're making progress on batteries, but have we made enough progress? So people's observations, I'm going to start with Keith this time, on how we can best secure the extra storage that it looks like we're going to need if we can't simply solve this problem by smoothing demand.
I was kind of thinking of deferring it to Cathy, since she's the kind of, the commercial person that works in this sort of space, and will know just how the costs and benefits will work out and how the market mechanisms will work. Normally, what you're wanting, I suppose, Cathy, correct me if I'm wrong, is you're able to buy the energy when it's cheap, store it, and then sell it again when the market price is high.
Well, that's
right.
One version.
There are consultants who charge a lot of money for that type of insight.
So I have to confess, my very first job in the industry was working for First Hydro doing the trading strategy for pump storage in
Was that about
1990.
at the time when a third of the units got mothballed?
Actually, yeah.
Oh.
It was just in the run up to NITA. So 99, I joined the industry. I was an academic before. But there's lots of different types of storage and they're useful for different things. So that's the original use of storage was really two things. The Norway was designed for Sizewell falling off. That's why the CEG built it. It was, if Sizewell fell off, it was the largest load in the system, Nick, at the time, wasn't it? And the idea was the pump storage can come on in a minute and sort things out. And when I was working in pump storage, what we would do is we'd do that, what we call arbitrage, sell electricity when it's expensive, buy it when it's cheap overnight, and that flattens out some stuff. But we also sold services to National Grid, which I guess you were in charge at the time, Nick. And so things like frequency response, that's like the cruise control in the system. If the frequency's dropping a bit, our generation would go up a bit. If the frequency's going up, our generation would go down a bit, and it just helps keep the frequency. And we provide reserve as well. We'd hold the units back and they could press a button and we'd come on. That's the original sort of uses for storage. Now, as Keith said, with the system, the frequency moves much more quickly now in the system than it used to when there's a lot of renewables, because you don't have those big rotating masses. So we've had to start, and this is what I was doing when I was at system operator, have more, buy more services, so buy a bigger volume, but buy quicker services. And that's where the batteries come in, because there's now a service that if the frequency drops outside its operating range, my battery comes on in 1 second and helps restore that frequency. And so I sit for approximately 90% of the week doing nothing. And then the battery comes on really, really quickly. And so what's going to attract the storage into the markets? You need markets. You need to know there's products there that you can deliver. You have to get an idea that there's a deep market there. But the reason we're investing a lot in batteries and storage in general, because we're looking at different types, is you can just see from everything we're doing, you need a lot of flexibility to manage the new system. And we have faith that as long as we keep going down the net zero line and we're bringing this wind and solar on, we will need the flexibility. And then it just needs very efficient markets. Now, whether local communities should invest in it, the problem is, I would say that you have to be quite sophisticated, I would say, to take part in the markets. Many people, we're one of the few people who build these assets and also trade them in the market. Most people will build the assets and then hand them over to someone who trades them on their behalf, and they get about 80% of the value.
So I take that, Cathy, as your vote is for large-scale battery storage.
Well, also, I think batteries in homes, but I think in your home, I'm less of an electric battery person and more of a heat battery person. I think it matches the load in your home better, but I don't know what other people think. I'd be interested in Nick's and Keith's view
It's a
on that.
cost thing. I mean, if the heat storage is, well, a hot water tank that's well lagged is a pretty good heat store. A building that's well lagged is not a perfect heat store, but is not too bad.
Right.
So that's cheap, basically. It's about the cost.
Let's hear from Nick. What's your view on this? Storage.
I think storage, and I was just thinking about my own presentation. It's like storage always gets mentioned a bit late in all this. Storage is going to be, absolutely critical to the energy system of the future, just because you're trying to replace the inherent storage of fossil fuels, and it's very difficult to do that without a whole new generation, a whole new category of storage. And I suspect it's going to be all of the above. It is going to be, inevitably, it's going to be at all levels of the grid, because the grid has been built from to ship high voltage down to low voltage down to customers. And so the grid is constrained at each level because you've only built what you had to. We've run an efficient operation. So as fossil fuel is taken out and you get heat and transport at domestic level starting to come on the electricity system, I think part of the solution is going to be battery storage at all levels of the grid, and perhaps even offshore with wind turbines, because why build 100% capacity from an offshore wind farm when you could build, for the wires, where you build 70%, and when it's trotting out at 100%, you stick it in the battery, and when the wind drops, you then flow it out. So I think, and I think right through to storage at domestic level, I absolutely agree with Cathy about thermal storage is the holy grail. If anybody can really get interseasonal thermal storage products, don't tell anybody, just patent it and get on with it, because it is absolutely so valuable, because of Keith's point about the big driver is cold weather. But of course, I've got some experience with a heat pump in a house, and it is interesting that in a well insulated house, you don't find it struggles really. It's less of an issue than people think. The Catapult's done work recently for Bays on 750 heat pump applications, which did actually make us think that most premises can probably manage that with a heat pump. But obviously storage and installation will make that much easier. I think various different types, thermal storage, hydrogen storage, I think is highly likely to be valuable in areas which are rich in wind power, as Cathy's presentation brought out. I think, can I finish this piece just by saying, actually on storage, as on everything, I'll pick up Cathy's phrase, we need to be a bit bolder, actually a lot bolder, at trying to get into the future. We can't just wait for this stuff to turn up. We need to have some real vigor about innovation and deployment.
Yep.
And just picking up on your hydrogen storage point, because the bit that's really hard, as well as the interseasonal bit, it's those days where there's no wind, and we're trying to work out what to replace our gas plant with, because we make quite a lot of money on those days. And we've been looking at, could we use renewables to create hydrogen and then have hydrogen peakers? So store the hydrogen and then use hydrogen peakers. We can't get the economics to work at the minute, but it's one of the potential solutions for those dark days. We're also looking at carbon capture and storage.
Very good. We've got a lot of questions being with it. So first of all, let's collect several from our audience here. There's gentleman there, yes.
Do we not get our dinner until we answer all of them?
Ah, well, you never know. We might turn off. Who knows? We might turn off the heating as well. Right. Yes. Far away.
Quick. My question, I guess, is about maybe the relationship between storage and generation and consumption, but particularly at a lower, more localized level. And it's kind of about the idea or the concept of like hyper-individualized energy generation, but collectivized consumption. So what if people could live in a place that generates energy, but spend most of their time working, playing, learning in a place where they use energy together? So, a lot of people work in one big building. And I guess that's in that kind of way, you would be able to have better infrastructure for this place where they use their energy. It would be more efficient. And I guess it's just that general concept of like individualized production, generation, but like collectivized consumption. Right. Does that make any sense at all? And is that in any way like a viable way to reduce our energy consumption?
I think we're talking also about changes in the system. I'm going to collect a couple of other questions there. We're going to move forward here. Yes, 2 rows. Yeah. Gentleman there.
Thank you very much. Nick and Cathy, you started to touch on this at the end actually, but at the beginning, Nick, you gave a maybe slightly more muted perspective on hydrogen. It's, as a domestic source of heat, nowhere near as efficient as heat pumps. Makes a lot of sense. But then we heard that actually there are going to be significant periods of excess generation in Scotland due to our inability to build transmission infrastructure out. So to what extent can we solve that problem just by producing a lot of hydrogen in Scotland and just driving it to other parts of the UK, putting in a pipeline? I'm presuming that's somewhat easier, particularly with respect to planning, than putting in transmission infrastructure. How much of the problem could that solve?
So let's start with Nick, both on hydrogen and that earlier question. And if I may add a supplement to that earlier question, I think to what extent is a system where there's large amounts of individualized generation, people putting into the grid from a solar panel on their roof or whatever, how big is a technical challenge is it to redesign and reinvest in a grid system that enables that very diffuse input to be transmitted across the grid? Just take us through the difference between operating a grid like that and one where it's a few great big power stations dotted across the country. So both issues, please.
On hydrogen, I think hydrogen storage, looks very very likely to be extremely economic in some place on the grid. I think hydrogen's extremely likely to be used in industrial complexes, in perhaps trains, but certainly heavy goods vehicles. That looks a pretty useful line. And I think where you're already investing heavily in electrolysis facilities, it will probably make sense to do either heat networks or hydrogen networks for domestic heating. It may go a lot further than that, but hey, that's a lot. That's an enormous amount given where we are on hydrogen. Hydrogen is going to have a big role. It's probably not going to be the vector for wholesale decarbonisation of domestic heating, but don't for a second, think that isn't a big role. Hydrogen is going to be very important. The storage thing is quite distinct, and you have to sort of think about. My guess is that there's two things you do. You can make it into hydrogen and then try to move the hydrogen by pipe. Is that going to be more economic than building the wires? Don't know. Keith may know. So you may just swap one constraint for another. I think tankering it looks unlikely to me. So you probably have to flow it out off peak. Using the same wires. So an integrated solution to that's very important. I think to the point about local energy, I should advertise Energize Leamington, a community energy company, which I'm currently helping to set up in lovely Leamington Spa.
Does it go as far as Warwick, where I live? Which
is, funny enough, I was in Warwick today talking about a school about greening their premises. That's Myton School. Be very, some of these things are lovely. They can inspire a community. They can inspire, in this case, school children to think about the future of energy in a completely different way. And genuinely, with energy prices where they've got to, there is an argument of sort of putting PV on anything that doesn't move, and probably some of the things that do move as well.
And the technical challenges of getting it onto the grid and operating a grid when
there are certainly regulatory challenges and in some places technical challenges. But when you think about the design of the grid is down. So the fundamental is if you stick stuff in at the bottom, it's generally pretty helpful. That doesn't mean everywhere. And sometimes you might have to reinforce. But at this time, injecting power at the bottom of the grid is broadly, in my view, likely to be positive for costs and economy.
And it will probably be used pretty locally, actually, anyway, won't it? Because all of my stuff up to now, all my batteries are actually in the distribution network, and we're moving higher in voltage now, because the problem with the distribution network is the DNOs, they're trying to change really hard, but they're used to power flowing one way. And now that we've got our batteries on their networks and they're moving really quickly, like coming on full load in 1 second, they're going, oh wow, this is doing weird things to our network that we didn't expect. And actually, we think we probably don't want you to do this anymore. And it's harder to get connections and stuff. So we still have a long way to go on working with the distribution network and that kind of stuff. But I'm on the board of Regen, which is not-for-profit consultancy that does a lot of local energy stuff. And it is definitely part of the solution, but it's not all of the solution. It's going to be a big mixture of things that works.
Right. And Keith, quickly, and also particularly that hydrogen question, because I pick up a bit slightly of a flavour that hydrogen, having been very fashionable, is slightly going out of fashion, that we're already past peak policy wonk interest in hydrogen. But
tell us 10-year cycle.
Tell us where are we on hydrogen at the moment?
So I think the case for hydrogen, I think I see it at the moment, has been, or for blue hydrogen, has been hit very hard by the cost of methane. So why would you want to do that? But the case for green hydrogen, I think still remains. It's that question of the seasonal storage, interseasonal storage, and hydrogen as a sort of storage vector is useful because you can use it for different things and you can move the hydrogen around.
Yeah.
You can kind of make it in one place, store the energy in the form of hydrogen, and then move the hydrogen to another place if you want to. And actually, as the cost of electrolyzers comes down, which surely it will, people like the Danes and the Dutch are already thinking about offshore artificial islands on which to put electrolyzers, to use all this huge amount of offshore wind energy to make hydrogen and move that around rather than move a voltage around.
And it's what you use the hydrogen for in the end. There's a hierarchy of things you make it's most valuable to do, and heat isn't near the top of it. Apart from, we're looking at, we provide a lot of steam on our Wilton site, and our customers want everything to be nice and green now, and it's the biggest hydrogen network is up there as well. But it's grey hydrogen right now, but hydrogen might be used a lot for industrial processes and things like steel and stuff as well, where instead of some of the processes we use right now. So maybe not so much for home heating, but industrial processes, it could be really, really important.
Right, thank you. I'm now going to move on to our next online question. And I should explain, by the way, that of course our online participants will leave us when this session comes to an end in 10 minutes or so, but we will, over supper, for people who are staying, have an opportunity for more interactive Q&A from the people here physically. This is an upvoted question, and which I have a lot of interest in, which I'll explain in a moment, about tidal power. We've had solar power, we've had wind power, we haven't, I think, really had any references to tidal power. And Chris Binney makes the point that, of course, especially if you had several locations around the country, if you want reliable, predictable, persistent, renewable energy, tidal power does look like a strong candidate with features, as I say, if you distribute around the country, not unlike a nuclear. He says with regulated asset-based funding, it could be similar in cost to nuclear. And for me, my former constituency down on the south coast, we always imagined sort of a big tidal power operation somewhere in the Solent, somewhere off the west coast of Wales, somewhere up north, and you start imagining you've got a tidal power infrastructure that you don't have to worry about whether the wind is blowing or whether the sun is shining. So why did none of you mention tidal is the question. Cathy, you first.
I guess I probably didn't mention it because there's none at the minute and I don't know a huge amount about it. Like, I do have one of my traders, he's just finished his master's in sustainability, and his master's thesis was actually on getting tidal along the coast and looking at the phase difference between them to create a base load, if you like, power.
Exactly.
Like, I don't know that much about the ecological side and if it has problems with that, but I really don't know why tidal hasn't developed, whether it's technical problems, whether it's cost, whether it's ecological. Do either of you know anything about it? Because I'm rubbish.
I would not count myself an expert at all, but I mean, the capital cost of, say, the tidal lagoon idea seems to be the big thing that hinders it. And then you've got to think about the ecological impacts, and there's certainly a lot of opposition in respect of the possible impacts. The other thing that seemed to be going in a good direction was tidal stream turbines. So there were some put in the Sound of Jura. I don't really know what happened to them actually. There was a big plans in the Pentland Firth. Again, I don't know quite what happened to all these big plans. I get one thing, they're kind of quite difficult to maintain. You've got to kind of get them out of the water and do what you need to do and put them back in again. But I kind of imagine that one of the things that you're trying to harness is all that enormous amount of energy, and the same amount of energy tends to kind of, move them around and break them. So,
well, I'm going to turn to Nick now. What the advocates would say is that the technology is probably 10 years behind offshore wind. And whilst there was a definite, clear strategy for promoting offshore wind with a contract for difference model, there's been no similar attempt to take tidal through the period when its costs are relatively high to a point when it becomes usable. And until, goes back to one of the themes of the intervention so far, until there's a strategy like that, it's hard for the industry to get through the early stages into full viability. But they think if there were an equivalent of a contract for different strategy for tidal, they could get there. But Nick, have you got any explanation, any answer to Chris Binney's question about why Nick mentioned tidal?
I don't have anything very up to date. I mean, there obviously was a huge debate about the Severn barrage, and there was very serious project to try to get to an economic solution. I think it's Keith's point, the economics of the very high capital cost certainly around that time looked challenging, but that's more an impression than me being closely involved with it.
I think some good news in the new contract for difference rounds, where I think there is a separate pot, in my understanding, for more innovative technology. So separate pot for established from less established. So there's a bit of a sign of hope there, I think.
Yeah. Then we've got a question from James Smith. How would future grid design cope with very large anticyclones that last several days, perhaps up to a week? If wind is negligible, there could be very high required storage of electricity. And just as, and let's develop that point, because there are some people who think that one of the features of climate change will be that we go through longer periods when the wind does not blow, or alternatively, also some periods when it blows so intensely, it's very hard to function. So there's a bit of a narrative out there that climate change may be making wind slightly less manageable than we may have hoped a few years back. Cathy, what are the prospects for wind, and what do we do with these large anticyclones?
So that's what I was saying. That's the bit I was saying. That's the bit we haven't solved yet, in terms of you need low carbon dispatchable generation, etc. Essentially, because storage ain't like, if you take a lithium ion battery, my current ones are 1 hour. We're building 2 hour ones. 4 hours seems manageable. 8 hours. Pump storage, the Norway is 9 hours of storage at full output. So that isn't going to wear it. We're looking, for instance, at carbon capture and storage plants, not standard CCGT, but we're looking at something called the alum cycle, where you burn methane, but it relies on gas, which is kind of interesting right now. But you burn methane and oxygen, and the carbon dioxide is the working fuel. But that would be good in that you can dispatch it, and it also provides all those services. We're looking at hydrogen generation as well, but this is all early stages. But it is exactly, along with the interseasonality, that's the other big problem that we need to sort on the system. But none of the storage solutions will do it. You need some sort of dispatchable generation to make it work.
I mean, you store the fuel, and that's what.
Exactly. That's why we're saying with the
said
hydrogen
earlier, about when we had fossil fuels, you can store them. I mean, you store them in the ground, store them in the caverns. You can get them out, store them somewhere else, and you can use them when you need them. You're not going to convert them back. So there's it's not a replenishable store, and that's why hydrogen seems kind of so interesting. That provides you a potential fuel that you can manufacture at times of surplus and use it, as Cathy suggests, in times of deficit. But I wanted to get the scale of the challenge. So there's a lot of this inherent storage in the gas network that we might not have available to us anymore. We closed the Rough storage facility. That was, what was that, sort of 30 terawatt hours or thereabouts. So to try and get a handle on the sense of scale of this, I think is really important. And, you could talk about it in hours or whatever, but it's how much of it, and the options for getting it.
Do you think closing that gas storage facility was a mistake?
I think it probably was. I'm not a gas analyst, but well, they had to spend some money to get it safe. So we're talking about, what was it, £1 billion to make it safe. I did pick out, so I was looking at this a little while ago and found an old document that said, it wasn't commercially viable because what we were talking about earlier about the price differences in the gas market were not big enough. They couldn't buy the gas cheap enough and sell it more expensive, at a high price to cover all of their costs. And they said, over the last couple of years, that price difference has got too small. The thing I found, and I wish I could find it again, suggested that barely a year or two later, the price difference was big enough.
But now, Keith, summer is trading higher than winter.
Well, we have to kind of look and see what's going on there.
It's the crisis.
Yeah.
And even if you go out, the prices are pretty flat. So what Germany is doing, for instance, is they're insisting people put gas in storage over the summer. That if you've bought storage capacity, you have to fill it up at a certain rate this summer, which is what's inverting that price. But they're making you pay for security.
Right. Nick, your comments on that, and also let's range, and I think you set this, you were the first person to make this point. In terms of public policy, kind of get on with it. There was at Resolution Foundation, we did some economic analysis of all this, where the good news was that on a 30 or 40-year view, the returns from investing in green energy were very substantial and offset the costs. And then eventually you had not just obviously you achieved zero carbon, but you actually had a more effective, more efficient system than you've got at the moment. But the investment had to happen up front and the returns happened down the track. And the theme that's emerged a bit is at some point, the analysis has to stop and people actually have to invest real money in real bits of kit, be it extra wind farms or an improved grid or storage or hydrogen or some combination. So tell us also how you see investment in an electricity provision of different sorts proceeding, and are we doing enough now?
Well, I think the key to this, in some senses, is being, obviously thoughtful, but also decisive and giving strong signals. So when we've seen things like governments in a variety of places talk about petrol and diesel cars, not being for the future, we've seen the automotive industry just do this amazing, job of developing technology and bringing it to customers, and customers by and large loving it. So we've seen a number of these sort of transitions where there's been decisive public policy. So I think that's quite important. We've seen in terms of wind power, a very, very strong intervention that's driven wind power from 150 pounds a megawatt hour to 40. I mean, this is extraordinary, So when you've got a decisive move from government to get a particular technology, either through regulation in terms of no more petrol or diesel, or through positive incentives, that unleashes the power of markets, and I'm always amazed at the speed of reaction. So I think it is important to be decisive. I actually believe that we need to signal something pretty strong on domestic heating. Otherwise, we're all going to continue to wait and hope that our domestic gas boiler isn't going to go wrong. And then when it does go wrong and it's cold outside and the van pulls up outside and he says, "Here, I've got one in the back of my van," and off you go into the replacement cycle. You've invested for another 15 years in something that the figures can't afford that. We can't hit net zero with our homes being full of gas-fired boilers. So we have to in a careful way be decisive and learn from what's worked.
There was a phrase that was kind of popular for a short while and then very quickly afterwards became unpopular, which was, "I agree with Nick."
Very good. Now, we've overrun, but I'm going, as we have three such fantastic experts, I wanted to just ask you to get, and you're experts on energy as a whole, just go one beyond the electricity grid to the crisis, the Russia invasion of Ukraine and its massive impact on energy provision and energy investment, and invite you in your final remarks before we have a drink, and also over dinner. The people here physically will have their opportunity to put in more questions as well. Just tell us how you see, let's do this in reverse order, how you see the impact of the Russia-Ukraine crisis reshaping energy policy and energy investment in the UK. Keith.
I think the obvious thing that it should be doing is emphasising the need to reduce dependency on fossil fuels and gas in particular, and to be able to make more use of renewable energy, especially. Okay, other forms of low carbon energy come into play, and if we can have some confidence about our ability to build them at some predictable cost and bring that cost down, then okay, I think you know what I'm talking about. But definitely, it's a bit like the question, you kind of going looking for directions from someone local and they say, "Well, I wouldn't start from here." So we should have been doing this a lot more already. We've done a lot. I mean, Nick said we've had fantastic success in our wind sector and driving down the price. There are all these challenges that we've talked about this evening. So it's not without its difficulties, but it's just all pushing, I think, in the same direction of be much more efficient with our use of energy and reduce our dependency on gas.
Cathy?
I agree with Keith. But yeah, the thing for me is also getting the messaging right, because there's a lot of talk about, well, maybe we should stop the net zero, it's too expensive, what we need to go is go for fracking and stuff, and I'm sitting there going, right. But things like, if you look at the wind farms that have got CFDs with strike prices at 60, 70 pounds or whatever, even 150, right now they're paying back money to consumers because their strike price is less than the market price. But we don't actually advertise that stuff well enough. We're not looking at some of the benefits like that. And I think we have to stay. The biggest worry for me on investment is that we set the target for net zero, and that has given my company the confidence to invest in the UK, in the flex, and also because of government things like carbon capture and storage, because they're building a CFD for carbon capture and storage as well. So we have to try and keep the line, get good messaging out there as to why renewables are the way forward, but there is a danger we could get derailed, because there is a certain group of people that are trying to derail us now because they just don't actually believe in climate change, etc. as well.
Yep. Nick?
Well, I mean, the crisis in the Ukraine has made us focus on oil and gas. These are carbon intensive fuels. So, there are, I suppose there are, in my view, two things to say about it. I just wish we'd gone faster at getting carbon intensive fuels out of our economy. That would have made the position much stronger. But there's no point in regretting that now. Let's go faster now.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to our three excellent panelists for really illuminating some extraordinary complex issues and trade-offs, and linking engineering challenges, technological challenges, and also challenges in economics and public policy. Thank you for participating. I'm pleased we were able to overcome the sound problems earlier for our online participants. We will now adjourn and have a drink. We'll have supper at 8, and I apologize. I know there are still quite a few questions in the hall, and there will be an opportunity for those to be put over supper. Thank you all very much indeed. Yeah, good. Fascinating stuff.
Did you enjoy that?
Yeah. Gavin.